The doctor stepped out of the emergency room and looked straight at me. His voice was calm, professional, almost routine. "Is Emily Carter here?" I raised my hand without thinking. He nodded and said, "You're listed as the primary medical decision maker for your mother." The hallway went silent. I felt every eye turn toward me, and behind the glass door, my mother lay unconscious, the same woman who had spent most of my life treating me like a stranger. For over 30 years, she barely spoke to me unless she had to. She never defended me, never asked how I was doing, never introduced me as her child. To her friends, I was someone who lived with us for a while. To relatives, I was difficult. To her, I was invisible. So when that doctor read my name, the name she hadn't said out loud in decades, I thought he had made a mistake. I remember whispering to myself, "Why me? Why now?" And that's when the nurse added something that made my hands start shaking. "She filled out these forms years ago," she said. "Updated them regularly, even when she stopped seeing most of her family." I stood there frozen, trying to understand how a woman who acted like she didn't know me had trusted me with her life. That moment pulled me back through memories I had spent years trying to bury. A childhood where silence hurt more than shouting. A home where I learned to stay small, quiet, and out of the way. A mother who looked through me instead of at me. But what I didn't know then was that everything I believed about her was incomplete. There was a reason for the distance, a reason for the coldness, and a truth so heavy she chose to carry it alone. Before we go any further, if you've ever felt unwanted by someone who was supposed to love you, or if stories like this help you feel less alone, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. That way, even if life pulls you away, you can always come back and continue this story, and others that might mean more to you than you expect. Now let me ask you something. What would you do if the parent who hurt you the most trusted you more than anyone else when it mattered most? Because what I learned next changed how I see my mother and myself forever. I don't remember a moment when my mother was openly cruel to me. That's something I need to say first, because if she had yelled or hit or screamed, maybe it would have been easier to explain. What hurt was something quieter, something colder. I grew up in a modest house on a quiet street, the kind of neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. From the outside, we looked like a normal family. 2 parents, dinner at the table, school mornings, weekend chores. But inside that house, I learned early what it felt like to take up space without being seen. My mother never tucked me in at night. She never asked how my day was unless someone else was listening. When I spoke, she nodded politely, the way you do with a neighbor you don't really know. If I was excited about something, she would say, "That's nice," and turn back to what she was doing. If I was upset, she would say, "You're being dramatic," and that was the end of the conversation. I watched how she interacted with others in the family. The warmth in her voice, the patience, the way she remembered small details. And then I watched how her face changed when she turned to me. Not angry, not hateful, just blank. At family gatherings, she would stand beside me, but not next to me. If someone asked who I was, she would say my name, nothing more. No, this is my child, no pride, just a fact. I remember once, when I was around 10, a woman from church leaned down and smiled at me. "You look just like your mother," she said. Before I could respond, my mother laughed softly and said, "No, not really." That was it. She didn't explain, didn't soften it, just turned away. I didn't understand why that moment stayed with me for years. I just knew it did. At school, I learned to keep my head down. At home, I learned not to ask questions, because questions made her uncomfortable, and discomfort made her distant. When something went wrong, I was often the easiest explanation. If there was tension in the room, it somehow traced back to me. If there was silence at the table, I was told to stop sulking. And whenever I tried to defend myself, she would look at me with that same calm expression and say, "Stop making things harder than they need to be." That sentence followed me everywhere. I tried harder. I stayed quieter. I learned to disappear without leaving. What confused me most was that she wasn't cold all the time, just with me. I would see her laugh with relatives, comfort friends, worry about people she barely knew. So I told myself the problem must be me. Maybe I was difficult. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe this was just how some mothers loved. But even as a child, there was something I couldn't shake. It felt intentional, not careless, not distracted, deliberate, as if she had made a decision long before I was old enough to understand it. A decision to keep me at a distance, to draw a line and never cross it. There were no bedtime stories about when I was born. No stories about what I was like as a baby. When old photo albums came out, she flipped pages quickly. If I asked questions, she smiled thinly and said, "You don't need to worry about that." And somehow that answer always felt final. By the time I reached my teenage years, I stopped trying to get close to her. I stopped expecting warmth. I stopped waiting for her to notice. Instead, I watched her. I watched the way she measured her words around me, the way she avoided being alone in a room with me, the way she spoke about me to others as if I were already gone. And without realizing it, I learned how to become a stranger in my own home. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that this distance wasn't born from indifference. It was built on something much heavier, and the longer she kept it, the more damage it quietly did to both of us. By the time I reached my teenage years, the distance between my mother and me had settled into something permanent. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was routine. She spoke to me the way you speak to someone you share space with, but don't really know. Short sentences, neutral tone, no emotion to argue with, and none to hold on to. If I came home late, she didn't ask where I'd been. If I came home early, she didn't ask why. There was a strange kind of freedom in that, but it wasn't the good kind. It felt more like being dismissed before you even had the chance to matter. At school, teachers sometimes asked about my parents. Friends complained about their mothers being too strict, too involved, too emotional. I listened quietly and nodded, pretending I understood, because I didn't know what it felt like to be hovered over, or worried about, or missed. At home, tension showed itself in subtle ways. A sigh when I entered the room, a pause before she answered me, a look that said, "Don't make this harder." If something went wrong, I learned to brace myself. A broken dish, a misunderstanding, a rumor passed along by someone else. She never raised her voice at me. That almost would have been a relief. Instead, she listened to other people first. If a relative complained about my attitude, she nodded. If a sibling accused me of something I hadn't done, she didn't question it. She simply turned to me afterward and said, "You need to learn how to get along." I remember one afternoon especially clearly. There had been an argument in the house. Not loud, just sharp words and cold silences. Someone blamed me for starting it. I hadn't. I tried to explain, tried to say what really happened. My mother stood there, arms crossed, listening without interruption. When I finished, she looked at me for a long moment. And then she said, "I think we both know you tend to overreact." That was it. No follow-up, no curiosity, no doubt. In front of everyone, she chose the easiest version of the story, the one where I was the problem. That night, I sat in my room with the door closed, staring at the wall, trying to understand how someone could know you for your entire life and still not know you at all. After that, something shifted. She stopped using my name as often. When she needed me, she'd say, "Can you come here?" Never honey. Never anything warm. When she talked about me to others, I overheard phrases like, "They're very independent. They do their own thing. They don't really need me." It sounded reasonable, even kind, but it erased me at the same time. The strangest part was how normal it all felt. There were no dramatic confrontations, no final arguments, just a steady understanding that I existed on the edge of her life, not in the center. Once I accidentally heard her talking on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I just passed by the doorway at the wrong moment. She sighed and said, "I don't really know them anymore." She said it calmly, not sadly, as if she were talking about an old coworker. I stopped walking and stood there, my heart pounding, waiting for her to add something else. She didn't. That sentence stayed with me longer than any insult ever could, because it confirmed what I had felt for years, that somewhere along the way she had decided I was no longer her responsibility in the way a child should be. And I began to wonder, quietly, painfully, if I ever had been. What I didn't realize then was that this distance she kept was not the absence of feeling. It was the presence of fear, and it was shaping both of us in ways neither of us could undo. I left home earlier than most people do, not because I was brave, and not because I had a plan. I left because staying felt heavier than the unknown. There was no argument the day I packed my things, no dramatic goodbye, no final confrontation that cleared the air. I folded my clothes quietly, one drawer at a time. I carried boxes past the same walls I'd grown up staring at, and all the while, my mother stayed in the kitchen, moving around as if it were any other day. When I told her I was leaving, she didn't ask where I was going. She didn't ask how I would manage. She simply nodded and said, "Okay." That was it. No warning about the world being hard. No offer to help. No reminder to call. I waited for something more. A pause. A question. Even a look that said she might miss me. But nothing came. So I picked up my bag and walked out the door carrying with me a strange mix of relief and grief. The first few years on my own were rough. I lived in small apartments with thin walls and unreliable heat. I worked jobs that didn't care whether I was tired or not. I learned how to stretch meals and make do. And through all of it, there was a quiet part of me that kept listening for a phone call that never came. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was independent now, that I didn't need her. But late at night, when everything slowed down, I wondered if she ever thought about me. Holidays came and went. I spent them with friends, sometimes alone. I sent cards a few times in the beginning. She sent them back unsigned. Eventually I stopped. Years passed like that. I built a life. Not an easy one, but a steady one. I learned how to rely on myself, how to keep my expectations low, how to protect the parts of me that still hurt. And just when I thought the distance between us had become permanent, something small and unexpected unsettled me. I ran into someone who used to live down the street from us, an older woman who recognized me immediately. She smiled and said, "Your mother still asks about you." I laughed before I could stop myself. It came out sharp and disbelieving. "That's not possible," I said. "She doesn't even know where I live." The woman hesitated, then added, "She doesn't ask directly. She just keeps track." That stayed with me, not in a comforting way, in a confusing one. Over the next few years, there were small signs I couldn't explain. A message forwarded through a relative, asking if I was healthy. A gift sent without a note returned when I didn't acknowledge it. Once I noticed she had found my work address. No explanation for how. She never contacted me herself, never crossed that line. It was as if she were watching from a distance, close enough to know I existed, far enough to remain untouched. At first it made me angry, then suspicious, and finally tired. because it raised a question I didn't want to ask. Why would someone who treated me like a stranger still keep me in their line of sight? I pushed the thought away, told myself it meant nothing. But looking back now, I understand that was the moment the story began to shift, because her silence wasn't emptiness. It was restraint, and whatever she was holding back was heavier than I ever imagined. The truth didn't come all at once. It never does. It arrived in fragments, uncomfortable pieces that didn't fit the story I had told myself for years. It started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar. I was busy, tired, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end belonged to a distant relative, someone I hadn't spoken to in decades, someone who sounded nervous, as if they were already regretting calling. We exchanged a few polite words. Then there was a pause, and finally, they said, "I don't know if it's my place, but there's something you should know." I almost told them to stop. I almost said, I didn't want to hear it, but I stayed quiet. They talked about the past, about things that happened before I was born, about a period of time my family never discussed. Apparently, there had been a crisis, a serious one, a situation that forced choices no one wanted to make. They spoke carefully, choosing words like stepping around broken glass. And then they said something that made my stomach tighten. Your arrival wasn't planned the way people think. I asked what that meant. There was another pause. They explained that when my mother was pregnant with me, everything was already unstable. There were pressures from family, from expectations, from a truth that, if exposed, would have torn the family apart. I listened, barely breathing. According to them, my mother had been given an ultimatum, not spoken out loud, but understood. Protect the family's image, or protect the child fully. She couldn't do both. I wanted to interrupt, to argue, to say this was all speculation, but something inside me knew it wasn't. It explained too much. The distance, the avoidance, the way she never spoke about my early years, the way she kept me close enough to watch, but far enough not to be seen as hers in the ways that mattered. I asked the question I had avoided my entire life. Am I her child? The answer was complicated. Yes, they said, but not in the way people assume. They explained that legally, publicly, socially, I was hers. But biologically, the story wasn't simple. And she had known from the beginning. She had known when she first held me, when she first looked at me, when she made a decision that would define the rest of our lives. A decision to raise me under her roof, while never fully claiming me in public, never fully attaching in private. Not because she didn't care, but because caring openly would have exposed something dangerous. Something that could have destroyed more than just reputations. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time. The room felt too quiet. I replayed every memory I had of my mother, every moment of distance, every cold response. And suddenly those moments shifted. They didn't soften. They didn't hurt less. But they made a different kind of sense. Her silence hadn't been neglect. It had been control. Her distance hadn't been rejection. It had been protection. A way of keeping me safe from questions, scrutiny, and consequences I was never meant to carry. That night, I barely slept, because with that truth came another realization. If she had chosen this path deliberately, then she had been living with that burden alone. No sympathy, no understanding, no credit. To everyone else, she was just a cold mother. To me, she had been something worse, a stranger, and yet she had never once pushed me out completely. She had watched, tracked, prepared, which raised a question I wasn't ready to face. If she had sacrificed our relationship for my safety, what else had she been quietly doing all those years? And more importantly, what had she been preparing me for? After that phone call, I stopped looking at my past the same way. Memories I had spent years trying to forget began resurfacing on their own. Not loudly, not all at once. They came back quietly, the way truth often does when it knows you're finally ready. I started remembering things I had once dismissed as meaningless. How my mother never let certain people be alone with me. How she always positioned herself between me and one particular family member at gatherings. How she discouraged me from asking questions about my origins, but never discouraged me from leaving. At the time, it felt like indifference. Now it looked like calculation. There were rules she followed rigidly, boundaries she never crossed. She never hugged me in public, never praised me where others could hear, never corrected anyone who misunderstood my place in the family. But in private, there were moments that didn't fit the image I had built of her. She made sure I had health insurance long after I moved out. She quietly paid a bill I didn't know she had access to. Once when I was sick and missed work, a grocery delivery appeared at my door with no note attached. At the time, I assumed it was a mistake. Now I knew better. She had been present without being visible, involved without being acknowledged. And the more I thought about it, the more painful the truth became. She had chosen a role where she would be misunderstood by everyone, including me, because if she had been warm, if she had defended me openly, if she had claimed me the way a mother normally does, people would have asked questions. Questions she couldn't allow, questions that could have exposed me to scrutiny, gossip, and consequences that weren't mine to carry. So instead, she let me believe she didn't care. She let me believe I wasn't wanted. That was the price she paid for keeping a secret she thought would protect me. And I hated her for it. Not because I didn't understand her reasoning, but because understanding came too late. I thought about all the nights I cried alone. All the times I wished she would just choose me once. All the years I spent trying to earn affection she was never willing to show. And I realized something that made my chest ache. She had been strong in the only way she knew how. She had been cruel in order to be careful. And she had been lonely in ways I never considered. Because carrying a secret like that doesn't just isolate the child. It isolates the parent too. She couldn't explain herself, couldn't justify her actions, couldn't ask for forgiveness. She had locked herself into a role and stayed there for decades, even when it cost her the one relationship that mattered most. And maybe that was why she watched from a distance, why she tracked my life quietly, why she made sure I was safe without stepping into my world. She didn't want my love. She wanted my survival. That realization didn't erase the damage. It didn't heal the years of silence, but it shifted something inside me. Because for the first time, I stopped asking why she never loved me the way I needed, and started asking what she had been protecting me from. I didn't know the full answer yet, but I was beginning to understand that her coldness was not the absence of care. It was the presence of fear. Fear that if she got too close, if she let herself be seen as my mother in every sense of the word, someone else would notice. And that fear had shaped every choice she made, including the ones that pushed me away. I didn't forgive her that night, but I stopped seeing her as a villain. And in its place, I saw something far more complicated. A woman who had chosen to lose her child emotionally, so she wouldn't lose them entirely. What I didn't know then was that all of this, the silence, the distance, the preparation, was leading to a moment where I would be the only one standing between her and the consequences of her own choices. The call came on an ordinary afternoon. Nothing about the day suggested it would change anything. I was in the middle of my routine, thinking about things that suddenly felt unimportant. When my phone rang, I almost ignored it. The number was unfamiliar. Out of habit, I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. They introduced themselves from a hospital in another city. For a moment, I didn't understand what they were saying. Then I heard my mother's name. They told me she had collapsed. A stroke. Serious. Uncertain. I stood there, holding the phone, feeling oddly detached. My first thought wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It was confusion. Why were they calling me? We hadn't spoken in years. I wasn't listed in her phone. I wasn't part of her daily life. I told them there must be a mistake. There was a pause. "No," the nurse said gently. "You're the only contact we have." After the call ended, I sat down and stared at the wall. I tried to feel something decisive: anger, guilt, urgency. Instead, I felt tired. Tired of carrying a history that never resolved. Tired of being pulled back into a story I thought I had left behind. I told myself I didn't owe her anything, that whatever happened next was the result of choices she had made. But even as I thought that, I was already packing a bag. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it should have. Every mile gave me another reason to turn around. I thought about all the years she hadn't called, all the moments she had stayed silent. And I asked myself the question I had avoided for decades. If she woke up and saw me, would she even want me there? When I arrived, the waiting room was quiet. Too quiet. There were no other family members. No one pacing. No one asking questions at the desk. Just me. A nurse approached and asked my name. When I told her, she checked her clipboard and nodded. "She listed you," she said. "Years ago." She never changed it. That sentence landed heavier than anything else that day, because it meant this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a last-minute decision. She had planned for this, while keeping her distance, while maintaining silence, while letting me believe I didn't matter. I sat down and waited. Time moved strangely in that room, slow and fast at the same time. I tried to prepare myself for what I might see, for a face that no longer recognized me, for the possibility that nothing would be resolved. I didn't know if I wanted answers, or closure, or just an ending. All I knew was that for reasons I still didn't fully understand, I was the one they called, and that meant something, even if I didn't yet know what. When the doctor finally stepped into the waiting area, he didn't ask if I was ready. He simply looked at me and said, "Are you Emily Carter?" I nodded, and in that moment, I felt the weight of every year we had spent apart settle squarely on my shoulders. Because whatever happened next, I wouldn't be able to walk away from it. Not this time. The doctor led me down a long, narrow hallway that smelled faintly of disinfectant. The lights above us were too bright, too unforgiving. He stopped outside a glass door and turned to face me. "She's stable for now," he said, "but there are decisions that may need to be made." I nodded, even though my mind felt miles away. Through the glass, I could see my mother lying in the hospital bed, her hair thinner than I remembered, her face drawn unfamiliar in a way that made my chest tighten. For a brief moment, I wondered if she would recognize me at all. The doctor stepped aside to speak with a nurse. That's when I heard it. My name, spoken clearly, formally, without hesitation. Emily Carter is listed as the primary medical decision-maker. The words echoed in the hallway. I felt something shift inside me, like the ground moving under my feet. The nurse looked at me and smiled gently. She was very thorough, she said. She updated her paperwork regularly. I asked the question that had been forming since the first phone call. "Why me?" The nurse hesitated, then shrugged softly. She never explained. She just said, "You were the one she trusted." Trusted. The word didn't sit easily, because trust implied closeness, and closeness was something we had never shared. The doctor handed me a clipboard filled with forms, consent documents, medical history, legal authorizations. Her handwriting was neat, careful. She had signed my name next to hers, in places that required clarity, intent. This wasn't something done in a moment of fear. It was a pattern. I asked if anyone else had been contacted. The doctor shook his head. "We tried," he said. "No one else responded, and some numbers were disconnected." I realized then that she had narrowed her world intentionally. She had removed everyone who might complicate things. Everyone except me. As if in the end, she knew exactly who would show up. When I finally stepped into the room, she was still unconscious. Machines hummed quietly around her. I stood there longer than I meant to, looking at the woman who had shaped so much of my life without ever fully entering it. I thought about all the times she hadn't spoken my name, all the years she had kept me at arm's length. And yet here it was, written proof. I was the one she had chosen, not for comfort, not for conversation, but for responsibility. The doctor explained the situation carefully. Possible outcomes, difficult choices. I listened, nodding when appropriate, signing where I was told. My hand didn't shake. What surprised me most was the calm, because in that moment, the past stopped arguing with the present. Whatever she had been to me before, right now, she was vulnerable, and she had placed herself in my care. Before I left the room, I noticed something taped inside her chart, a small envelope. The nurse handed it to me. She asked that you have this, she said, if anything happened. Inside was a single piece of paper. No long explanation, no apology, just a sentence written in the same careful handwriting. If you're reading this, it means I trusted you enough to let go. I folded the paper slowly, because suddenly the distance between us didn't feel like rejection anymore. It felt like preparation, and whatever she had been holding back all these years was finally about to surface. Whether I was ready or not, my mother woke up just before dawn. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden rush of nurses. Her eyes opened slowly, as if she were surfacing from a very deep place. When she saw me standing near the bed, she didn't react right away. She just looked at me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I waited for confusion, for her to ask who I was, for that familiar distance to return. Instead, she took a shallow breath and said my name. Not loudly, not emotionally, but correctly. That alone unraveled something inside me. I pulled a chair closer and sat down. The machines continued their quiet rhythm, as if they were the only ones comfortable with the silence between us. She didn't ask how I was, didn't ask where I had been all these years. She looked tired, not just physically. Finally, she spoke. You didn't have to come. Her voice was weak, but steady. I told her I knew that, and that I came anyway. She nodded, as if that confirmed something she had already accepted. We didn't talk about the past right away. She asked for water. I helped her sit up. It felt strange, caring for someone who had never let me feel cared for. After a while, she said, I know I wasn't kind to you. The words were simple, almost understated. I waited for an explanation, an apology. Instead, she looked away. I did what I thought would keep you safe, she said, and I knew it would cost me you. That sentence hit harder than anything else she could have said. I asked her what she had been protecting me from. She closed her eyes for a moment before answering. There were people in this family who should never have had access to you, she said, quietly. Questions that would have followed you your entire life. She didn't give names. She didn't give details. She didn't need to, because suddenly the pieces aligned. She had built walls not to shut me out, but to keep others away. I couldn't love you openly, she continued, because if I did, someone would have looked too closely. Her hand trembled slightly as she rested it on the blanket. I needed you to grow up without being pulled into things that weren't yours. I told her that it hurt, that it still hurt. She nodded again. I know, she said. I lived with that every day. There was no plea for forgiveness in her voice, no attempt to ease her conscience, just acceptance. Before I could stop myself, I asked the question that had haunted me since childhood. Did you ever think of me as your child? She turned her head and looked at me fully then. Yes, she said. Every day. That was when I understood the final truth. She had never treated me like a stranger because she didn't care. She had treated me like one because it was the only way she knew how to protect me. And in doing so, she had sacrificed the one thing she wanted most, a relationship with the person she loved quietly from a distance, for a lifetime. We didn't resolve everything in that room, but for the first time, we were honest. And sometimes, honesty is the beginning of something neither side ever thought they'd have. I didn't leave the hospital feeling lighter. There was no sudden peace, no moment where everything made sense and fell into place. What I felt instead was clarity. It came quietly, without relief attached to it. Over the next few days, I stayed nearby. I spoke with doctors. I signed papers. I made decisions I never expected to make for her. And through all of it, she remained calm. She didn't ask for favors, didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't try to rewrite the past. She accepted my presence the way she had always done things, without drama, without demand. That alone told me she wasn't trying to fix anything for herself. She just wanted things handled properly. At one point, a social worker asked if there were other family members who should be contacted. I paused before answering. There were names I could have given, people who shared blood history, obligation, but none of them had shown up. So I shook my head. No, I said, I'll handle it. The words surprised me as much as they surprised anyone else. Not because I suddenly felt close to her, but because I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't about what she deserved. It was about who I wanted to be. I thought about the younger version of myself, the child who waited for warmth that never came, the teenager who learned to survive without being seen. I realized that if I walked away now, out of bitterness, I would be repeating the same pattern that had shaped us both. Distance, silence, unspoken resentment, and I didn't want to carry that anymore. So I stayed, not as an act of forgiveness, and not as an act of revenge, but as an act of choice. I chose not to pretend the pain hadn't happened, and I chose not to let it define my final role in her life. When she was strong enough to speak again, she thanked me once, quietly, without emotion. I nodded and said nothing. We both understood that gratitude didn't erase the past, and neither did explanation. Some wounds don't close neatly, but they can stop bleeding. When the time came for me to leave, she looked at me and said, "You don't owe me anything." For the first time in my life, I believed her, because what I did next wasn't for her. It was for me. I walked away knowing I had shown up when it mattered, that I hadn't abandoned myself in the process, that I had ended a cycle without pretending it never existed. I didn't forgive her completely, and I didn't need to. What I did was let go of the version of her I had built in my mind, the cold figure, the stranger. In her place, I saw a flawed human being who made a devastating choice and lived with it in silence. And I finally allowed myself to move forward without carrying her decisions as my identity. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from reconciliation. It comes from understanding and from choosing not to pass the pain on. That was the decision I made, and for the first time, it felt like it was truly mine. As someone who has spent years listening to family stories like this, I want to say something important before we end. Not all harm looks loud. Not all neglect looks like abandonment. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from silence, from distance that was never explained, from love that existed but was never allowed to show itself. What happened between this mother and child is not a story of good and evil. It's a story of fierce secrecy and choices made under pressure, choices that protected one thing while quietly damaging another. And this is where many people struggle, because understanding does not erase pain, and forgiveness is not a requirement for healing. Healing begins when you stop asking, "Why wasn't I enough?" and start asking, "What did this situation force people to become?" Some parents fail, not because they don't love, but because they don't know how to love safely. And some children grow strong, not because they were nurtured, but because they had to survive emotional absence. If you've seen yourself in this story, whether as the child who felt invisible or the parent who made choices they regret know this. You are not alone, and your story does not end with what was taken from you. It ends with what you choose to do next. Choosing not to repeat the cycle is one of the most powerful acts of healing there is. If stories like this help you reflect, feel, or finally put words to experiences you've carried for years, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That small action helps these stories reach others who might be listening quietly, just like you once were. And if you have a moment, ask yourself one final question. What would change in your life if you stopped carrying someone else's silence as your burden? Thank you for staying until the end. Take care of yourself